A single gentle habit can unlock a door no one ever knew existed. At Willow Creek Diner, where the morning light always spilled in pale gold through the long windows, no one expected secrets to break open. It was just breakfast hour in a forgotten corner of the Midwest, quiet, predictable, almost sleepy. And yet, something was about to shift. Margaret Maggie Halloran, 62, moved with a slow steadiness behind the counter, her joints stiff, but her presence warm.
She'd worked this diner longer than most of the town had lived here. Every morning she filled the air with the smell of fresh coffee from the old glass carafe, dark liquid swirling like memory itself. She didn't talk much anymore, but people trusted her. They always had. Near the counter, a little girl, maybe 8 or 9, sat with her shoulders tucked inward. A quiet child who came in daily, always alone at first, always with the same gray hoodie. She barely spoke, but she always carried a small wooden box no bigger than Maggie's palm. Its lid was carved with something intricate, something almost too delicate for a child to be holding. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Maggie set a white ceramic cup down gently and leaned closer to the girl. "You're early again, sweetheart," she murmured. Her voice had that soft rasp of someone who'd worked through decades of dawns. The girl opened the little box just enough to peek inside, a habit Maggie had noticed for weeks. Something inside glimmered faintly, a metallic edge catching the diner's warm light. Then Maggie froze. She knew that design. The carved, phoenix-like swirl on the lid, the tiny groove at the corner, it tugged at an old, buried place in her mind. "My mother," she whispered before she could stop herself. "My mother had a box just like this, almost identical." It was a simple sentence, gentle, unplanned, but it cracked the room open. The girl stiffened. Her small hand snapped the lid shut. The diner door swung open, not loudly, not dramatically, but the entire atmosphere tightened anyway. A tall man in a charcoal business suit stepped in the kind of posture that never bent. His hair was silver at the temples, his expression carved in granite. Behind him, 4 men in black stood in a formation too precise to be coincidence. Not customers, not locals, not anything ordinary. Every conversation in the diner faltered. Forks paused midair. Someone's newspaper rustled to an abrupt stop. The man's eyes locked onto the girl, then shifted to Maggie's hand still hovering near the closed wooden box. "That," he said, his voice low and controlled, "does not concern you." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was a verdict. Maggie kept her grip on the coffee pot, knuckles whitening around the warm handle. Decades of hardship had taught her to stand still in the presence of storms. She met his stare with quiet steadiness. The girl slid off her stool, instantly inching behind Maggie's apron, clutching the back of her sleeve as if she'd done it 1,000 times before. But she hadn't. Not once. Not ever. The tallest bodyguard stepped forward, placing himself between the girl and the rest of the diner, forming a wall of black fabric and silent authority. Maggie felt pressure build in the room like the air itself was waiting for someone to breathe wrong. "I didn't mean to pry," she said softly, her voice even. "I just noticed the carving. It reminded me of something from my childhood, that's all." The man's jaw flexed, but his expression did not change. "The box stays closed, and you stay away from her." The girl's fingers tightened, small and trembling, around Maggie's sleeve. And in that trembling, Maggie realized something that made her chest tighten. Whatever this child was running from, it had just caught up to her. Maggie felt the diner settling into an unnatural stillness, as though every sound had been swallowed by the tension that followed the suited man and his silent entourage. Yet she kept her movements steady because years of early mornings had taught her that stillness could be a shield when words became dangerous. The man's eyes swept the counter, hard and assessing, as if he were searching for any detail that might betray a threat. and Maggie recognized the look not from men in suits, but from old farmers, checking storm clouds, trying to gauge whether something dangerous was brewing. She realized then that this wasn't simply a protective father walking into a diner. This was someone who had lived too long under the weight of secrets, and secrets tended to make people rigid in all the wrong ways. The girl's shoulders curled inward, and Maggie, drawing from the same instinct that had once soothed her own siblings during hard winters, lowered herself slightly so her voice would meet the child where she stood rather than towering over her with unnecessary authority. The coffee pot gave off a faint hiss as steam evaporated along the rim, and she used that tiny sound to reintroduce some sense of normalcy, murmuring gently that the morning rush would start soon, and they couldn't block the walkway for the other customers. The suited man took a single step forward, and the 4 bodyguards mirrored the movement with frightening precision, forming a semicircle that transformed the cozy diner into something resembling a controlled perimeter, though the townsfolk had no frame of reference for such choreography, and only stared with a mixture of awe and unease. Maggie knew this kind of pressure could crush a child's resolve, so she asked the girl quietly if she wanted to sit back up at the counter where the light was warmer and the air didn't feel so heavy, but the girl only shook her head and pressed closer as if Maggie were the only shield she trusted. Maggie felt a slow realization settle inside her. A recognition that the wooden box wasn't just a sentimental trinket, but a tether to a truth much heavier than the girl could possibly understand, and she mentally traced the phoenix-shaped carving she had glimpsed earlier, wondering how something so delicate could stir echoes from decades ago. She remembered her own mother's box, long lost during a move after her husband died, and the thought that this stranger's child might be carrying a near-identical object stirred questions she didn't dare voice. Trying to maintain a thin thread of normalcy, Maggie told the man she had no intention of interfering and that the girl was merely startled, yet her voice carried more strength than she expected, revealing an unspoken conviction that children deserve gentleness, even when adults failed to offer it. The man studied her with a tightened jaw, as though he wanted to argue, yet also recognized that fighting an elderly waitress in a small-town diner would draw the wrong kind of attention, so he answered only with a curt nod that offered no warmth or trust. Still, he could not hide the faint flicker of something, perhaps guilt, perhaps exhaustion, when he glanced down at the girl who refused to step toward him, and Maggie sensed that the man's authority, while sharp and rigid, contained cracks born from long stretches of fear or grief he refused to name. She noticed one bodyguard, the tallest one, looking not at her but at the wooden box, with an expression that faltered for a fraction of a second, revealing a familiarity that should not have existed unless the box carried significance beyond sentimental value. That single crack of uncertainty planted the seed of the first investigative thread in Maggie's mind, and she wondered whether the man had expected the girl to carry the box in public or whether its appearance here had caught him off guard, suggesting that secrets he believed tightly controlled were beginning to slip beyond his grasp. She remembered the faded jewelry workshop at the edge of town, shuttered years ago but still holding drawers of unclaimed custom orders, and she considered the possibility that the box or its design could be traced back to someone who once lived here, someone who knew a truth too heavy to carry alone. The girl loosened her grip just enough for her small fingers to brush the inside of Maggie's wrist, a silent plea that broke whatever barriers remained between them, and Maggie realized she could not simply step aside, because something about this child felt heartbreakingly familiar in a way she couldn't yet articulate. She gently placed the coffee pot on the counter, letting the soft thump punctuate her resolve, and met the man's gaze with a steady firmness that belonged to a woman who had endured too many hard winters to be frightened by polished shoes and expensive fabric. The diner's atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly as customers pretended to read menus they already knew by heart, all hoping someone else would break the unbearable silence. Yet Maggie stood rooted in place, understanding that she might have already crossed a threshold she didn't mean to approach, but couldn't walk away from now. The man finally exhaled a slow, tense breath that acknowledged the moment had slipped beyond his control, and he instructed the girl to come with him, his voice steady but tinged with a strain that betrayed deeper worry. The child didn't move. Instead, she whispered, barely audible, "I don't want to go." And the words hung in the diner like a fragile thread stretched to its limit, suggesting that whatever waited outside for her was far more terrifying than the man's stern command. And when Maggie stepped slightly in front of her, not aggressively, just enough to show the girl she wasn't alone, the entire room felt the shift. The old woman with the weathered hands had just changed the balance of the morning, and nothing about Willow Creek Diner would ever be simple again. Maggie sensed the girl's whisper rippling through the diner like a fragile signal begging anyone to listen carefully enough to hear the truth hiding behind it, and she steadied herself because moments like this had a way of rewriting the air long before they ever rewrote lives. The man's expression tightened as he watched his daughter cling to a stranger, yet something deeper flickered behind his stern facade, hinting at a conflict he had spent years forcing into silence. The bodyguards stepped subtly closer, forming a protective arc around their employer, but their controlled movement only emphasized how unprepared they seemed for a child who refused to obey the unspoken rules of their meticulously managed world. Maggie felt the girl leaning into her with the instinctive trust of someone who had endured far more than she should have, and the weight of that trust pushed Maggie toward a sense of responsibility she hadn't expected to feel when she first lifted her coffee pot that morning. She chose her words carefully, speaking with the calmness of someone who had managed countless kitchen fires and family emergencies, asking the man gently if the child might stay for a warm drink while they sorted out whatever misunderstanding had unsettled her so deeply. The man's jaw clenched again, not in anger but in hesitation, as though he were calculating risks he couldn't speak aloud, and for the first time Maggie noticed how exhausted he looked beneath the immaculate suit and commanding posture. The tall bodyguard's eyes drifted again toward the wooden box, betraying a flash of recognition too quick to be casual, and Maggie filed that detail away because people seldom glance twice at something they don't fear or remember intimately. She remembered the old jewelry workshop near the abandoned train depot, the one rumored to have once crafted custom pieces for wealthy families before closing after a scandal no one in town had ever fully explained. Pieces of half-forgotten conversations stirred in Maggie's mind, stories about a woman who had left town abruptly years ago, carrying something precious that others desperately wanted back, and the thought unsettled her, because the timelines whispered possibility rather than coincidence. She realized that the girl's box, with its delicate phoenix carving, might not simply resemble her mother's lost keepsake, but might actually belong to the same lineage of objects tied to a story larger than either of them had understood. Trying to bridge the tension without provoking the man's defensiveness, Maggie crouched slightly and asked the girl if she would like to sit down again, emphasizing safety and warmth rather than conflict, because frightened children responded better to gentleness than commands. The girl hesitated before nodding, sliding back onto the counter stool with small, tentative movements that seemed practiced from years of self-protection, and Maggie felt a quiet ache watching her struggle between obedience and fear. The man stepped closer, placing his hand on the counter with a controlled precision, suggesting he was accustomed to negotiating situations far more complicated than a small-town diner, yet something about his stance felt brittle, as though he were balancing guilt on the edge of duty. He spoke in a voice that carried both authority and fatigue, explaining that his daughter had been through too much recently and tended to react strongly to unfamiliar environments, but Maggie sensed the explanation only covered a fraction of the truth. The diner's customers watched in uneasy silence, aware that something heavy floated beneath the surface of every exchanged glance, yet none dared to interrupt because they sensed instinctively that this moment had moved beyond ordinary breakfast-hour complications. Maggie leaned her elbows gently against the counter, adopting the posture of someone ready to listen rather than confront, and asked the child whether the box had belonged to her mother, choosing her words with delicate care to avoid reopening wounds she didn't yet understand. The girl's fingers tightened around the wooden lid, and her eyes glistened with a sadness far too old for her face, revealing that the object held memories she wasn't ready to speak aloud, though its weight clearly shaped every part of her trembling posture. The man reacted immediately, taking a half-step forward with a tension that suggested fear rather than anger, warning that the topic was personal and should not be brought up in public. Yet Maggie noticed the way his voice wavered slightly at the mention of the girl's mother. That small tremor in his tone cracked the room open again, revealing a deeper fracture beneath his carefully controlled exterior, and Maggie understood that the missing pieces of this family's story were not only painful but possibly dangerous. The bodyguards exchanged brief glances, subtle but noticeable, signaling that they, too, were accustomed to managing delicate truths that could not be spoken openly without triggering consequences. None of them were prepared to face in a crowded diner. Maggie realized the three investigative threads, forming quietly in her mind, could no longer be ignored. The workshop that had crafted objects like the girl's box, the rumored woman who had vanished under mysterious circumstances, and the father whose authority seemed built upon secrets rather than simple protectiveness. These threads wove themselves into a pattern she didn't yet understand, but she felt its shape forming, and the weight of that realization pressed her into a deeper resolve to at least offer the child a haven, however temporary. The man closed his eyes for a brief, pained breath, and when he opened them again, the hardness in his expression had softened just enough to betray the turmoil brewing inside him, suggesting a man trapped between roles he could not reconcile. Maggie saw the moment his facade faltered, a moment revealing that he had not come here to intimidate the town or force obedience, but rather to salvage something broken and rapidly slipping beyond his control. The girl looked at Maggie with a pleading tenderness that pierced even the heavy air around them, and Maggie understood that the child recognized her as a rare refuge, someone who saw her fear rather than her father's authority, and that realization alone reshaped the dynamic between everyone present. The father's voice finally dropped into a low admission that he was trying to protect his daughter from forces she could not possibly comprehend, yet the sorrow behind his eyes revealed that his attempts had already fractured more than they had repaired. Maggie inhaled slowly, steadying herself, because she knew instinctively that whatever truth was hiding behind this man's carefully controlled silence was about to spread through her quiet diner in a way that would change everything. And she met his gaze with a calm firmness that invited honesty rather than deflection. The girl's small hand slid into hers with unexpected boldness, and that single gesture, fragile yet resolute, made it clear that the first real crack in the family's guarded story had just been made by a child seeking comfort rather than answers. Maggie felt the small hand inside her palm trembling with a mixture of fear and yearning, a silent plea so powerful that it pulled her deeper into a story she had never meant to enter, yet somehow felt destined to witness. The father's eyes remained fixed on the girl with an intensity that suggested he was fighting battles on more fronts than anyone in the diner could possibly imagine, and the weight of those unspoken wars pressed heavily across his shoulders despite the rigid armor of authority he tried to maintain. The bodyguards stood as statues, but Maggie noticed how one of them shifted subtly, betraying a crack in composure that seemed tied to the girl's refusal to move, hinting that the situation had reached a point far beyond the neat boundaries of their training. She lifted her chin with gentle steadiness, speaking in a tone crafted carefully between softness and resolve, suggesting that perhaps the child needed a moment of calm before being rushed into anything that frightened her deeply. The father's jaw tightened, although his eyes flickered with something raw that felt too human to ignore, revealing a vulnerability that clashed sharply with the intimidating silhouette he projected. He told Maggie that the girl had endured several traumatic incidents over the past year, and that sudden changes in routine often caused her to panic, yet the slight tremor beneath his words hinted that these incidents were far more serious than he was willing to describe aloud. Maggie sensed the truth straining behind his caution, like a locked door rattling on its hinges, ready to burst open if someone simply asked the right question with enough compassion to cut through layers of fear. She stepped slightly closer to the girl, ensuring her presence remained a steady anchor, and asked the father gently whether the wooden box carried something precious that reminded the child of her mother, noticing how the man instantly stiffened at the mention of the woman he had avoided naming. The air between them grew taut, as though every molecule held its breath while waiting for the man to decide whether honesty or defense would win this silent battle. and Maggie's heart tightened because she recognized the look of someone haunted by regrets that refused to stay buried. The tallest bodyguard glanced again toward the box with that same flash of recognition, and Maggie realized this was no mere trinket but a key threaded through the family's deepest, most painful truth. The man exhaled slowly, placing one hand over his eyes for a brief moment, revealing the accumulated exhaustion of someone who had been running from shadows far longer than anyone should endure, before finally admitting that the box had belonged to the girl's mother, who had disappeared under circumstances he still could not fully explain. His voice wavered when he added that the carved symbol on the lid represented a lineage tied to a very old family dispute, one that he had tried desperately to shield his daughter from ever understanding. The confession cracked something open between them, and even the bodyguards lowered their focus slightly, acknowledging that the situation had shifted from rigid protocol to genuine emotional fracture, the kind that no amount of professional training could contain. Maggie felt a surge of sympathy for the man despite the severity of his arrival, recognizing that he was not simply a controlling father but a grieving one, trapped between protecting his child and confronting the ghosts of a wife he had lost far too soon. The girl's voice emerged in a soft whisper as she admitted that she kept the box close because it made her feel as though her mother were still watching over her, providing comfort during nights when fear curled through her dreams and chased her into uneasy sleep. The father closed his eyes again, but this time the gesture carried a heaviness shaped by guilt rather than frustration, as though he regretted every moment he had failed to offer the tenderness his daughter clearly needed. Sensing the window of honesty widening, Maggie asked whether the mother had left of her own accord or whether something had forced her away, but the man's reaction answered the question before his words could, because his shoulders tensed in a way that suggested a long history of danger, secrets, and perhaps betrayal lingering just beyond what the girls should ever hear. He revealed cautiously that the mother had been involved in complex family matters tied to inheritance and legacy, matters that had spiraled out of control and placed both herself and her daughter in jeopardy. Maggie absorbed every word carefully, understanding that she was hearing only fragments of a much larger truth. Yet the weight of those fragments was enough to reshape her perception of the morning entirely, transforming this breakfast hour into the epicenter of a story that had been smoldering beneath the surface for years. The man admitted that he had been searching for answers ever since his wife vanished, but the few clues he found only led to more questions, each one tangled with warnings to leave the past alone. The girl reached into the wooden box with trembling fingers, retrieving a tiny folded slip of paper worn from being handled too often, and she pressed it gently into Maggie's palm, trusting her more than she trusted the imposing figure, standing only a few feet away. Maggie unfolded it with slow, deliberate care, discovering a faded line written in delicate cursive that read, "If anything happens, look for the phoenix." The father froze when he saw the note, and his face drained of color, as though someone had ripped a long-buried truth straight into the open for the first time, and Maggie realized instantly that the simple carving on the box was not decorative, but a coded symbol meant to lead someone towards something, or someone important. Every person in the diner sensed the shift, even if they didn't understand its meaning, because secrets that had simmered quietly for years were suddenly unraveling under the flickering diner lights, leaving the small space humming with the fragile electricity of truth, pushing its way toward daylight. Maggie felt the girl's hand tighten again, and she understood that the next word spoken would determine whether this family's story finally stepped toward healing or spiraled deeper into silence, and she prepared herself to guide them carefully across that fragile line. Maggie closed her fingers gently around the faded slip of paper, feeling the thinness of the worn fibers as though they carried the pulse of the woman who once wrote the message, and the weight of that fragile relic pressed against her palm like the heartbeat of a truth trying desperately to survive. The father watched her clutch it with a mixture of dread and resignation, suggesting that he had spent years hoping this moment would never come, because acknowledging the note meant reopening wounds he had spent every waking hour trying to cauterize. The girl leaned closer, drawing strength from the elderly woman's steady presence, and Maggie could feel the tiny tremor in her small shoulders, a vibration born not from cold, but from a sense of impending revelation she could not yet understand. The diner seemed to tighten around them as the morning hum of clinking silverware faded into a quiet so sharp that Maggie could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock above the door, each second marking the slow unraveling of secrets that refused to stay buried. The father finally spoke with a voice carrying the brittle timbre of someone confronting a past he once believed he could outrun, admitting that the phoenix symbol represented an old family faction that had split from the main lineage decades ago due to a bitter inheritance dispute, a fracture that grew into something far more dangerous as generations sought to reclaim what they believed had been stolen. He revealed that his wife had been one of the few remaining descendants connected to both sides of the feud, making her presence a threat to those who feared what she knew or represented. Maggie listened with careful patience, noting how the man's explanation lacked details in all the places where fear stuttered through his words, and she realized that the stakes extended far beyond family tension, touching something darker that had the capacity to reach across states, cities, and years. The tallest bodyguard shifted behind him, looking toward the diner windows as though expecting someone to walk in at any moment, and the gesture filled the room with a new kind of anxiety, one that made Maggie's skin prickle with awareness. She recognized the look of a man scanning for threats he had encountered before, the kind that moved quietly through back doors and whispered warnings rather than leaving visible traces, and the realization chilled her more than she cared to admit. The father continued, explaining that the mother had discovered a ledger tied to the family dispute, containing evidence suggesting that her branch of the family had been unlawfully cut from the inheritance through forged documents and dangerous alliances, leading her to hide the ledger and disappear soon after. The girl's lips quivered as she whispered that her mother had promised they would run somewhere safe together, but that promise dissolved one night when the woman vanished without a trace, leaving only the wooden box and the cryptic note that had sustained the child through months of unanswered questions. The father's face contorted with quiet grief as he admitted that he had searched relentlessly for clues, only to discover conflicting stories that led him in circles, each lead ending with veiled hints that he should stop digging if he valued his daughter's safety. As he spoke, Maggie noticed a flicker of movement outside the diner's wide front window, a dark sedan idling across the street, with tinted windows that obscured the occupants, and something about the stillness of the car made her blood run cold. The tallest bodyguard caught the reflection in the stainless steel napkin holder and subtly tapped the other guard on the arm, communicating silently with the precision of men accustomed to being hunted as often as they were hired to protect. The father followed their line of sight and stiffened instantly, revealing a fear so visceral that it cracked whatever composure he had managed to hold onto in front of his daughter, and Maggie realized that the danger tied to this family had not been exaggeration, but a shadow that moved with intention. She instinctively pulled the girl closer, shielding her with her arm as though age and worn joints were irrelevant compared to the instinct to protect a child in need, and the girl's fingers dug into Maggie's sleeve with renewed desperation. The father spoke more urgently now, explaining that members of the opposing faction had been spotted in nearby towns over the past few weeks, moving quietly through hotels and business fronts, searching for any clue that might lead them to the ledger or the girl's mother. His voice trembled when he admitted that he had received warnings suggesting that the child might be targeted next if someone believed she knew where the missing document had been hidden, even though she was far too young to remember its last location. Maggie felt her heartbeat thudding heavily against her ribs as she realized that the diner had unwittingly become a crossroads for a conflict older and more dangerous than anything this quiet town had seen in decades. And the mulled scent of coffee and warm pancakes did nothing to soften the jagged edges of that truth. She asked the man if he believed the sedan belonged to the people who had been following him, and the silence that followed her question confirmed everything she needed to know long before he managed to nod. The girl whimpered softly, clutching the wooden box tighter as though afraid it might be taken from her, and Maggie brushed a steady hand across the child's back, whispering that she was safe here, even though she wasn't entirely sure that reassurance was true. The father dragged a trembling hand through his hair, revealing how deeply the situation had worn him down, and admitted that he had hoped the danger would subside long enough for him to find answers, but the reappearance of the sedan meant that time had run out. Maggie inhaled slowly, grounding herself in the familiar scents and sounds of the diner, understanding that she now stood at the intersection of past and present, truth and deception, innocence and danger, and that the choices made in the next few minutes would shape the fate of this frightened child. She straightened her spine despite the ache settling through her joints, and met the man's eyes with a resolve forged from decades of quiet endurance, letting him know without words that she would not allow harm to reach the girl while she still drew breath. The father swallowed hard, recognizing something fierce and unyielding in the elderly woman's gaze, and for the first time since he entered the diner, he looked less like a man running from danger, and more like someone finally finding the ally he didn't know he needed. The sedan outside remained still, dark, and watchful, waiting with the patience of a storm gathering just beyond the horizon while inside the diner. The fragile threads of truth and danger finally intertwined, setting the stage for a confrontation that none of them could avoid any longer. Maggie watched the father's expression tighten as the dark sedan lingered across the street, its motionless posture radiating a quiet menace that settled over the diner like a storm cloud, waiting for the right gust to burst open. The girl pressed closer against her side, trembling with the instinctive dread of someone who had learned too early that danger rarely announced itself with loud footsteps, and Maggie could feel that tiny body vibrating like a trapped bird desperate for a safe branch to cling to. The tallest bodyguard adjusted his stance, placing one hand discreetly near the inside of his jacket, revealing that he carried far more than brute strength beneath his disciplined posture, and the entire diner seemed to inhale sharply as every remaining customer realized they were witnessing the beginning of something far larger than a family argument. Maggie steadied herself by placing both palms on the counter, grounding her breath in the familiar texture of the worn laminate surface, and reminded herself that fear had no place here, while a child clung to her for safety. The father shifted his weight toward the window, and the guarded tension in his posture told Maggie he recognized the vehicle not as a possibility, but as a confirmation that time had finally run out, forcing him to confront the very threat he had been trying to outrun for months. His voice trembled slightly as he admitted that the people watching them were connected to the faction that believed the ledger held enough evidence to rewrite inheritance lines, financial controls, and alliances built across decades of ruthless maneuvering. The revelation cracked the thin layer of composure that had held the morning together, and Maggie felt the diner tilt around her, as though the simple smell of coffee and frying bacon could no longer anchor a reality that had suddenly grown teeth. She realized that the father's reluctance to share the full truth came not from arrogance but from a desperate attempt to protect his daughter from a world poisoned by greed, betrayal, and generational conflict, and her heart tightened with a complicated blend of sorrow and resolve. The girl whispered something unintelligible into Maggie's sleeve, her breath warm and shaky against the fabric, and Maggie bent closer to catch the words, recognizing them as a plea for someone to make the danger stop, even though she knew such comfort could not be promised with honesty. The father turned sharply toward them, his voice cracking with the helplessness of a man who feared he had already failed too profoundly, admitting that he had never wanted his daughter to inherit the burden her mother carried, yet now saw no way to shield her from the forces closing in. The bodyguards exchanged terse glances, silently debating their next move, because they understood better than anyone that the opposing faction was unlikely to wait much longer once they realized the girl was inside, vulnerable yet guarded by only 5 people who could not risk a chaotic confrontation in a public space. Maggie recognized the urgency forming between their stiffened shoulders and clenched jaws, and she made a swift decision she had not expected to make when she arrived at the diner before dawn, with aching knees and a worn apron. She stepped forward with a steadiness that surprised even herself, telling the father that they had no time to argue about who should protect whom, because the danger outside would not hesitate to strike if they wasted precious seconds on misplaced pride or fear. The man stared at her with a stunned mixture of disbelief and gratitude, clearly unaccustomed to elderly women volunteering themselves in the face of violent family politics, yet visibly relieved to find someone who refused to crumble under the pressure consuming him. Maggie suggested that they move the girl away from the front windows and into the narrow hallway near the kitchen, a space partially concealed by stacked supply boxes and a metal shelf that offered at least a semblance of cover, and the father nodded sharply because he understood that any barrier, however small, could change the outcome of a dangerous encounter. The bodyguards quickly adjusted their formation, creating a human shield around the child as they repositioned toward the back of the diner, and the coordinated movement broke the spell of stillness that had held the room captive. The father followed closely, but Maggie noticed how he lingered near the girl with a protective intensity that softened the sharp edges of his posture, revealing the deep love he carried beneath layers of fear and frustration. And she felt a surge of empathy for a man who had clearly been fighting alone for far too long. As they moved down the narrow hallway, the fluorescent light above them flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows along the walls that made the small space feel like a fragile refuge suspended between safety and collapse. Once they reached the back, the father knelt beside his daughter, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face with a tenderness that contradicted the hardened authority he had displayed earlier. And Maggie realized that the looming danger had finally forced him to let the mask fall. His voice softened as he promised the girl they would find a way through this, and the quiet desperation in his tone revealed how deeply he feared failing her again, especially now that the threat had stepped into full view. Maggie placed the phoenix-carved box gently on the metal shelf beside them, noting how its delicate design contrasted starkly with the cold industrial surface, and the symbolic juxtaposition reinforced her sense that this small object held the power to upend legacies shaped by greed and betrayal. The father stared at the box with a mix of grief and fear, saying that the ledger connected to the phoenix symbol had the potential to expose decades of corruption within the rival faction, which explained why they would pursue the girl with such relentless determination. The oldest bodyguard finally spoke, revealing in a low voice that the people hunting them had been escalating their efforts in recent weeks, tracking movements with increasing aggression, and that this diner stop might have marked the moment when the opposing faction decided to make a decisive move. Maggie felt the hallway constrict around her as the truth settled heavily across her chest, and she knew that whatever happened next would require courage far greater than anything she had anticipated when she first noticed the child's trembling shoulders earlier that morning. The father looked at Maggie with a sincerity that bordered on reverence, thanking her for standing with them despite having no obligation to risk herself, and the emotion in his eyes suggested that her presence had restored a sliver of hope he had long believed extinguished. She answered with a quiet firmness that courage didn't disappear with age, and that sometimes the people who had endured the most storms were the ones best equipped to stand tall when danger came knocking. The sedan engine rumbled faintly outside, its ominous vibrato slipping through the diner walls like a warning carried on the wind, and Maggie realized with chilling clarity that the confrontation they had been bracing for was no longer a distant threat, but an impending certainty drawing closer with every passing second. In that fragile pocket of silence between fear and action, she tightened her grip on the girl's trembling hand and prepared herself for the moment when shadows would finally step into the light, forcing them all to face the truth that had been circling them like a silent predator since dawn. The faint rumble of the sedan's engine seeped through the diner walls like a trembling warning, vibrating in the narrow hallway where Maggie stood protectively over the girl, and the low hum carried an unsettling promise that whatever waited outside had no intention of turning back now. The father's face drained of color as he exchanged terse glances with the bodyguards, each movement laced with the quiet urgency of men who understood precisely how quickly a situation like this could collapse into chaos. Maggie tightened her hold on the girl's hand, feeling the child's fear pulsing through her small fingers like a flickering heartbeat searching for something steady to anchor itself to, and that fragile desperation strengthened the old woman's resolve more fiercely than any shouted command ever could. She stepped subtly in front of the father and his security team, placing her aging frame between them and the single narrow doorway leading back into the diner, signaling with calm defiance that she intended to stand directly where any danger would first appear. The father protested with a strained urgency, insisting that she move behind them because they were trained to handle violent threats, yet Maggie shook her head slowly, explaining that people capable of frightening a child this deeply would not be deterred by brute force alone. Her voice carried a quiet steeliness, forged through years of surviving storms that came without warning, and the father hesitated because he sensed that she spoke with the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had lost enough to understand what truly mattered. The hallway lights flickered again, casting elongated shadows along the scuffed linoleum floor, and Maggie felt those shifting outlines gathering around them like premonitions of a confrontation that had been inching closer with each moment the girl had clung to her sleeve. The tallest bodyguard leaned toward the father and whispered that the sedan door had just cracked open, a subtle movement almost invisible to untrained eyes, but enough to indicate that someone inside was preparing to step out. The father swore under his breath, pacing a tight circle before forcing himself still, and Maggie recognized the panic slipping beneath his calm surface, revealing a man who had exhausted every method of protecting his child, only to find danger still pressing at their heels. She reached out and touched his shoulder lightly, reminding him that running had clearly failed, and perhaps standing their ground together might shift the outcome in a way they had not yet allowed themselves to believe possible. His eyes softened with gratitude mixed with bewilderment, as though he struggled to understand why an elderly woman who barely knew them would risk herself against forces powerful enough to haunt experienced security professionals, yet Maggie knew her reasons required no elaborate explanation. She had watched too many frightened souls pass through this diner over the years, carrying burdens no one else bothered to see, and she refused to let this child become one more story swallowed by indifference or cowardice. From the far end of the hallway, the shortest bodyguard spoke quietly into an earpiece, confirming that someone had stepped out of the sedan and was now assessing the diner's entrance with the slow, predatory caution of a person accustomed to measuring a target before making a move. Maggie's spine prickled, as though cold fingers had traced an icy line from her neck to her lower back, but she stood immobile, despite the instinct to retreat, grounding herself in the resolve that had carried her through decades of hardship. The girl pressed her head against Maggie's arm, whispering that the person outside had scared her once before, although she did not remember where or when, and the shaky confession filled the hallway with a new layer of dread that deepened the father's guilt. He crouched beside her, smoothing her hair with trembling fingers as he promised that he would not let anyone separate them again, though the strain in his voice betrayed how uncertain he felt about keeping that pledge. Maggie raised her chin, stepping forward until she reached the threshold where the hallway met the main dining room, and she took in the sight of the quiet diner, now transformed into a stage awaiting the arrival of something dangerous enough to fracture the morning completely. She moved the phoenix-carved box from the shelf to the counter just within reach, sensing that the object's symbolic weight would matter in whatever confrontation lay ahead, even if she did not fully understand how. The father joined her at the doorway, his breath shallow but determined, and one of the bodyguards positioned himself near the front windows while another slipped quietly toward the side entrance, preparing escape routes should they need to move the child quickly. Maggie shook her head gently and argued that panic and retreat would only embolden whoever waited outside, insisting that they meet the danger with steady minds rather than desperate scrambling, because fear-driven choices invited the kind of mistakes predators relied on. Her calmness surprised the father, who asked how she could remain so composed when everything around them seemed poised to crumble, and Maggie answered that age had taught her the difference between threats meant to intimidate and those meant to destroy, and that this one carried the dangerous patience of the latter. Her voice echoed faintly through the narrow passage, weaving a quiet tapestry of courage that strengthened the fragile unity forming between them, an alliance built not from trust alone, but from necessity forced upon them by a threat too large to face individually. A heavy silence settled as footsteps approached the diner's entrance, slow and measured, each tap vibrating through the floor like the countdown to an inevitable collision, and Maggie felt the tension coil through the father's shoulders as he braced for whatever walked through that door. She placed one steadying hand on his arm, reminding him with a soft murmur that fear only controlled those who surrendered to it, and that his daughter needed him to stand firmly, even if his heart trembled beneath the weight of uncertainty. The footsteps stopped just beyond the threshold, and a quiet knock echoed through the diner, 3 deliberate taps delivered with the controlled confidence of someone who believed themselves welcome even where they were feared. And Maggie sensed that the storm had finally reached their door. She inhaled deeply, straightened her spine, and prepared herself for the moment when the truth, the danger, and the past would converge in the space, bathed by flickering diner lights, knowing that her next words and choices would shape everything that followed. With the girl clutching her sleeve, the father standing rigid beside her, and the bodyguards forming a tense half-circle ready to respond, Maggie held her ground as the door handle began to turn slowly, signaling that the time for silence had ended and the confrontation they had tried to delay could no longer be avoided. The handle turned with a slow, deliberate motion that carried the eerie confidence of someone entirely certain they belonged on the other side of the threshold, and Maggie felt the girl's fingers tighten around her sleeve until the knuckles turned white with fear. The father drew a shaky breath as the diner door swung inward, revealing a man whose presence filled the room with a quiet danger more unsettling than any shouted threat could have produced, because he moved not with the brashness of a violent intruder, but with the calm assurance of someone who believed he had every right to claim whatever lay inside. He wore a neatly tailored coat the color of rain-soaked charcoal, and his eyes, cool, distant, and disturbingly patient, scanned the diner with a precision that suggested he had already studied every possible exit long before stepping through the door. The faint hum of conversation died instantly, leaving only the low buzz of the overhead lights, and Maggie recognized that this man was not merely dangerous but accustomed to watching fear bloom in others like a predictable pattern. The father stepped in front of Maggie with a stiff, protective instinct, though the tremor in his posture betrayed an undercurrent of dread, and the newcomer's mouth curved into a thin smile that lacked any trace of warmth, as though he took quiet pleasure in witnessing the discomfort he caused. He greeted the father by name in a tone dripping with false civility, remarking how unfortunate it was that their paths continued to cross in such tense circumstances, especially given the delicate history that bound their families together. The father's voice cracked as he insisted that the man leave immediately because the girl had nothing to offer him and no knowledge of the ledger he sought, but the intruder waved a dismissive hand, explaining that children often absorbed more truth than adults realized, especially when raised by a mother who excelled at hiding things in plain sight. Maggie felt the girl's breath hitch with panic, and she lowered her voice to a soothing whisper, promising that she would not let anyone take her away, even though the promise felt as fragile as the cracked tiles beneath their feet. The newcomer stepped closer, maintaining enough distance to appear courteous, while radiating a meticulous menace that made every person in the diner instinctively shift backward, and he observed Maggie with a faint, amused curiosity, noting that he had not expected an elderly waitress to place herself between a powerful family and its unfinished disputes. Maggie met his stare with the steady resilience of someone who had survived far more than he could imagine, and her silence forced him to turn his amusement into irritation when he realized she would not be intimidated easily. He criticized the father for allowing a stranger to stand in the way of matters far beyond her comprehension, insisting that familial conflicts must be resolved by those born into them, not by outsiders who mistook kindness for strength. Maggie responded with a calm, unwavering firmness, reminding him that compassion was not weakness, and that a child's safety mattered more than the tangled grudges of wealthy men hiding behind old symbols and inherited power. The man's cold eyes narrowed with a subtle shift that signaled the beginning of a more calculated confrontation, and he addressed the father directly, accusing him of withholding information about the ledger's location, even though such stubborn loyalty had already cost him his wife. Maggie inhaled slowly, steadying herself, because she knew instinctively that whatever truth was hiding behind this man's carefully controlled silence was about to spread through her quiet diner in a way that would change everything. And she met his gaze with a calm firmness that invited honesty rather than deflection. The girl whimpered softly, burying her face against Maggie's arm, and the intruder turned his attention toward the child with a chilling detachment, noting that her mother had once shown similar bravery when cornered, though the memory seemed to amuse him more than it pained him. Maggie stepped slightly forward, blocking his line of sight with a deliberate firmness that surprised even the bodyguards, and she told him that any man who frightened a child to gain leverage had already abandoned whatever moral claim he believed he possessed. The intruder's smile flickered with a microscopic fracture, as though her remark had touched a nerve he was not accustomed to exposing, and he asked whether she understood the consequences of inserting herself into affairs that had drawn blood long before she ever poured her first cup of coffee in this diner. Maggie held his gaze without flinching, calmly answering that the worst consequences in life often grew from silent bystanders who convinced themselves they had no right to intervene when innocence was threatened. The man tilted his head, studying her with a mixture of annoyance and reluctant respect, and he admitted that her resolve complicated matters more than he anticipated, though not enough to alter the trajectory of what must be done. He reached into his coat not for a weapon, but for a slim envelope marked with the faint imprint of the Phoenix emblem, and placed it gently on the counter between them, explaining that it contained the first piece of evidence proving the mother had betrayed multiple sides of the family conflict before vanishing. The father's knees nearly buckled as he stepped forward to seize the envelope, and Maggie noticed how his hands shook violently when he opened it, revealing a faded photograph of his wife, standing beside a man whose face had been partially burned away by time or deliberate damage. The girl looked up with wide, trembling eyes, whispering that she recognized the faint outline of the coat in the picture, and the father nearly collapsed at the realization that his daughter had remembered something he had prayed she would never recall. The intruder seized the moment, insisting that the mother had played both factions for her own gain, disappearing when her lies could no longer sustain the weight of her secrets, and he declared that the ledger was the final key to exposing her deception. Maggie sensed immediately that his confidence was too rehearsed, too polished, and too conveniently timed, which made her suspect that the envelope carried only fragments of truth twisted carefully into a narrative designed to fracture their unity. The girl suddenly gasped, pointing at a barely visible shape in the corner of the photograph, an indistinct silhouette positioned behind her mother, partially obscured by shadow, and Maggie felt the tension spike sharply as the father leaned closer, realizing with dawning horror that the silhouette did not belong to the man in the picture, but to someone else entirely. The intruder's expression tightened when he noticed their reaction, and Maggie understood instantly that this overlooked detail was never meant to be seen because it threatened to unravel the story he had woven so meticulously. And in that single breath of recognition, flickering like a spark trapped in a storm, they all realized the mother had not betrayed anyone at all. Someone had been following her long before she vanished, and that shadow had just stepped through their door. The photograph trembled slightly in the father's unsteady grip as he traced the faint silhouette lurking behind his wife, and the realization that someone else had shadowed her ignited a sharp, icy dread that spread through the narrow hallway like a crack racing across fragile glass. The intruder's composure faltered for the first time since he entered the diner, his eyes narrowing with a brief flicker of alarm that betrayed far more truth than any polished explanation he had offered so far. Maggie watched him with the instinctive perception of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the subtle shifts in people's expressions, and she recognized that his confidence had fractured in the precise moment he realized the shadow in the photograph had been noticed. She stepped closer to the father, gently steadying his trembling elbow as she urged him to look again, guiding his gaze not toward the partially ruined face of the man beside his wife, but toward the ambiguous silhouette that contradicted everything the intruder had tried to suggest. The girl swallowed hard, tugging softly at Maggie's sleeve as she whispered that she remembered someone following them before her mother disappeared. Though her memories came in blurry fragments shaped more by fear than clarity, and the ache in her voice tightened Maggie's resolve. The intruder attempted to regain control of the narrative by dismissing the shadow as a trick of the light or an accidental background shape, yet the brittle tension in his tone made the excuse crumble before it could take root. The father straightened abruptly, holding the photo closer to the flickering hallway light, and he demanded to know why the intruder had never mentioned the presence of a third figure when presenting the photograph as evidence of betrayal. His voice cracked with a blend of anger and desperation, revealing the deep grief that had long been buried beneath layers of guilt, fear, and unanswered questions, and Maggie felt the emotional tide shifting decisively away from the man who had entered the diner with such cold confidence. The intruder stiffened, attempting to reclaim authority by insisting that the mother's actions had endangered everyone involved, but Maggie cut him off with a calm, steady firmness that struck harder than any raised voice could have, reminding him that truth did not survive long in the company of half-spoken accusations and convenient omissions. Her words landed like quiet blows, unraveling the threads of his controlled demeanor, and she noticed the faint twitch at the corner of his jaw, a small betrayal of frustration at being challenged by an elderly woman he had clearly underestimated. One of the bodyguards stepped forward slightly, his eyes locked on the intruder as he acknowledged the growing discrepancy between the man's earlier claims and the photographic evidence now contradicting him, and the newcomer's irritation deepened as he realized he was losing the control he had relied upon so heavily. The father's breathing quickened, not from fear but from the dawning understanding that his wife's disappearance may never have been a matter of betrayal, and that she might have been running from someone more dangerous than either faction had ever admitted. Maggie could feel the pieces aligning into a new pattern, one that exposed the cracks in the intruder's carefully constructed story, and she pressed gently but firmly for more answers, asking him why the photograph had been partially damaged and why the shadowed figure had been left unmentioned in every explanation he provided. Her words slid through the tension like a deliberate wedge, widening the cracks in his authority until he no longer stood as the composed messenger of family truth, but as a man struggling to hold together a narrative collapsing under its own weight. The intruder's voice lost its earlier smoothness, as he insisted that the mother had manipulated circumstances for personal gain. Yet his arguments faltered because every syllable was now laced with an undercurrent of irritability and fear, revealing the desperation simmering beneath his polished exterior. Maggie stepped closer, the girl still clinging to her arm, and she reminded him in a quiet, unwavering tone that children rarely misremember the presence of danger, especially when shadows follow them for reasons they cannot articulate. The father inhaled sharply, piecing together the fragments of his daughter's memories with the damning silhouette in the photograph, and he demanded to know whether the intruder had played a role in his wife's disappearance or had simply benefited from the story crafted in her absence. His voice, though trembling, carried an anger sharpened by months of grief and unanswered questions, and Maggie saw something inside him resurrect a faint but growing belief that the truth might finally be within reach. The intruder stepped back slightly, a rare sign of discomfort flickering through his expression, and the movement caught the attention of everyone in the hallway, including the bodyguards who subtly adjusted their stance to reflect the shifting balance of power. Maggie seized the moment with quiet precision, pointing out that genuine truth did not fear scrutiny, while lies often crumbled at the first touch of an honest question, especially when children and photographs stood as unyielding witnesses. Her words sliced neatly through the tension, undermining the intruder's authority and shifting the room's emotional weight toward the frightened girl who now held more power in her trembling memories than she had ever understood. The father's eyes filled with a combination of rage and relief as he acknowledged the possibility that his wife had never abandoned them, but had been running from a threat neither he nor his daughter could have foreseen. The intruder's carefully crafted mask began to fracture, revealing glimpses of the fear and calculation hiding beneath, and Maggie realized that he had not come to provide answers, but to ensure his version of the story remained unchallenged. She drew herself up with quiet dignity, explaining that the truth often emerged through the smallest overlooked details, and she gestured toward the silhouette with a steady hand as she declared that this overlooked figure changed everything they thought they knew. The girl whispered that the shadow reminded her of someone she had seen near their old home, a person who never spoke, but always lingered near the edges of her vision, and the father's breath caught as he understood that his daughter's memories held the key to exposing the lie at the heart of the intruder's narrative. The man's composure finally cracked, revealing a flash of panic behind his carefully controlled expression, and the atmosphere shifted sharply as Maggie stepped forward with the steady certainty of someone who had just gained the leverage they desperately needed. And in that sudden stillness, charged with revelation and fear, Maggie saw the truth as clearly as the flickering lights above her. The story of betrayal had never belonged to the mother. It belonged to whoever had been hiding behind her in the shadows. Her words landed like quiet blows, unraveling the threads of his controlled demeanor, and she noticed the faint twitch at the corner of his jaw, a small betrayal of frustration at being challenged by an elderly woman he had clearly underestimated. His breath came in shallow waves as the truth clawed its way through years of guilt and confusion, and the weight of that revelation nearly buckled his knees as he whispered that everything he had believed until now might have been constructed from deliberate lies. The intruder's expression tightened into a rigid mask as he realized his earlier facade could no longer withstand the shifting tide of suspicion, and Maggie could see the faint pulse hammering at the base of his neck, a tiny betrayal revealing how deeply the discovery unsettled him. She stepped forward with the steady composure of someone who had witnessed countless human fractures across years of working in a diner, and she could sense that the man's certainty was unraveling thread by thread as the truth slipped beyond his control. The girl clung to Maggie with a fragile trust that radiated through her trembling limbs, and Maggie lowered her voice to reassure the child that no photograph or stranger's accusation could rewrite the love her mother had carried so fiercely, a sentiment that made the intruder's jaw tighten with palpable irritation. The father exhaled sharply, straightening his shoulders as though reclaiming a piece of himself that had been stolen the day his wife vanished, and he demanded that the intruder explain why the shadowed figure in the photograph had been conveniently omitted from every explanation provided earlier. The man attempted to regain ground by insisting the silhouette meant nothing, but the desperation leaking into his tone betrayed the crumbling foundation of his authority, especially as Maggie pressed him gently yet firmly to explain why the photograph had been partially damaged, in areas that would have clarified the presence of the third figure. His composure cracked further when one of the bodyguards stepped closer, acknowledging that the photograph had likely been altered intentionally to conceal evidence of someone tailing the mother long before she disappeared. The intruder's annoyance grew into visible frustration as the father confronted him again, asking whether he or someone within his faction had been following the mother, and the question struck with the force of an emotional blow that left the man visibly shaken. His response came too slowly and with too many careful pauses, suggesting that he was weighing every word to avoid revealing a truth that could undermine not only his authority, but the entire narrative upon which his faction depended. Maggie watched him closely, recognizing that his hesitation carried the unmistakable scent of guilt, and she stepped into the space between his faltering confidence and the frightened family he had sought to manipulate. She reminded him, in a voice woven with steady moral strength, that truth never needed to hide behind damaged photographs or half-spoken accusations, and that a man who relied on intimidating a child for leverage had already surrendered whatever legitimacy he believed he held. The intruder's eyes hardened into a sharp, cold glare meant to silence her, but Maggie did not flinch, maintaining her quiet defiance with the unwavering presence of someone who had endured far worse than a wealthy man's temper. The father seemed to draw strength from her refusal to back down, and he demanded again that the intruder reveal the identity of the shadowed figure, his voice rising with the desperate urgency of someone seeking answers to wounds that had never healed. The hallway grew impossibly still as the intruder shifted his weight, clearly grappling with the realization that silence would no longer protect him, and he attempted to pivot the conversation by claiming that the mother had been unstable in the months before her disappearance. Maggie immediately sliced through the lie with a calm remark pointing out that instability did not explain the presence of a concealed figure stalking her movements, nor did it justify altering evidence to hide that fact. Her words struck with unexpected force, causing the intruder's composure to fracture even further, and the father suddenly stepped close enough to confront him directly, demanding the truth with a raw intensity that reverberated through the narrow corridor. The intruder finally snapped, admitting that someone else had been following the mother, someone operating outside the faction's control, yet he refused to offer a name, suggesting that the truth carried consequences far more severe than any of them understood. Maggie sensed immediately that this was the first unfiltered truth he had allowed himself to speak, and she pressed gently but insistently for him to continue, reminding him that withholding information from a grieving family only perpetuated the harm he already helped inflict. The intruder's shoulders sagged slightly, as though the burden of unraveling lies had become too heavy, and he confessed that the shadowed figure belonged to a rogue operative who had been tracking the ledger independently, someone feared even within the darker corners of their fractured family factions. The father inhaled sharply, realizing that his wife had been hunted by more than one side, and Maggie's heart ached when she saw the grief flicker across his face as he whispered that he had blamed her for running when, in truth, she had been trying to save them both. The intruder's voice lost its earlier smoothness as he insisted that the mother had manipulated circumstances for personal gain, yet his arguments faltered because every syllable was now laced with an undercurrent of irritability and fear, revealing the desperation simmering beneath his polished exterior. The intruder's mask finally cracked completely as he admitted that he had been ordered to retrieve the ledger before the rogue operative found it, and Maggie realized that the man standing before them was not the shadow that had driven the mother into hiding, but rather a desperate participant in a game far larger than he ever intended to play. His voice wavered as he added that the rogue operative was believed to be operating independently now, driven by motives unknown to either faction, and that the danger surrounding the girl stemmed not just from greed, but from a hunger fueled by personal vendettas. The weight of this revelation shifted the balance of power sharply, and Maggie sensed that the intruder's authority had all but evaporated, leaving him exposed and vulnerable to the moral scrutiny unfolding in the cramped hallway. She stepped closer, her voice steady as she told him that the only path left for him now was the truth, because lies had already destroyed too many lives, and she would not allow him to harm this child with another one. The intruder stared at her with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant respect, recognizing that she had just dismantled the last barrier protecting his carefully constructed facade, and he exhaled with a defeated heaviness that signaled the beginning of a long overdue unraveling. The father placed a trembling hand on his daughter's shoulder, whispering that they would uncover the full truth together, and Maggie felt a sharp swell of resolve as she understood that the path toward justice had finally begun to reveal itself. The father's eyes filled with a combination of rage and relief as he acknowledged the possibility that his wife had never abandoned them, but had been running from a threat neither he nor his daughter could have foreseen. The intruder's carefully crafted mask began to fracture, revealing glimpses of the fear and calculation hiding beneath, and Maggie realized that he had not come to provide answers, but to ensure his version of the story remained unchallenged. The hallway seemed to shrink around them as the intruder's forced composure dissolved into the brittle remnants of a man who had finally lost the narrative he had clung to for far too long, and Maggie could feel the shift like a cold draft slipping through the cracked window of a quiet room just before a storm settles overhead. The father stepped forward with a trembling mixture of fury and sorrow, confronting the collapsing facade with a voice sharpened by every year of guilt he had carried, demanding to know why no one had told him that his wife had been hunted by forces far more complex than any family feud. The intruder's shoulders sagged as the weight of every lie and omission pressed down on him, and his voice faltered when he attempted to explain that revealing the rogue operative's involvement earlier would have endangered them all, though the excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears. Maggie listened with a calm steadiness that contrasted sharply with the rising emotional tide around her, sensing that the final threads of deception were unraveling faster than the man could repair them, leaving him exposed beneath the harsh flicker of the hallway lights. The girl pressed her face against Maggie's arm, trembling with the fragile intensity of a child who suddenly understood that her mother's disappearance had not been a choice, but a desperate attempt to escape someone far more dangerous than the sharply dressed man now struggling to justify himself. Maggie bent her head toward the child with a gentle murmur, reassuring her that the truth-changing shape around them did not alter the love her mother carried so fiercely, and the father's breath hitched as he heard the unwavering conviction in her voice. The intruder paced a short, fractured line across the narrow space before admitting that the rogue operative had once been part of the faction's inner circle, a man who possessed the rare combination of intelligence, patience, and ruthlessness necessary to manipulate both sides of the conflict. His voice lowered across the room with a chilling deliberation, settling on the girl with the unnerving certainty of a man who had spent years navigating the darkness behind other people's lives, and Maggie stepped forward before he could take another step. Her voice, steady and unshaken, cut through the thick silence as she reminded him that no pursuit, no matter how old or twisted, granted him the right to steal a child's safety, and the moral force behind her words momentarily halted, even the man accustomed to walking through fear like a familiar corridor. The father moved beside her, standing shoulder to shoulder with the elderly woman who had carried his daughter's fear more bravely than many trained protectors, and he declared that he finally understood the truth his wife had tried to reveal through her desperate warnings and hidden messages. The rogue operative regarded them with a calculating tilt of his head, but Maggie recognized the faint fracture flickering behind his eyes, a small crack caused by the unexpected unity standing before him. One of the bodyguards stepped subtly toward the operative, signaling that they were no longer merely defensive but prepared to counter whatever threat emerged, and the balance of power in the diner shifted so visibly that even the flickering lights seemed to catch the change. The operative hesitated for the first time, realizing that the family he had hunted had finally found allies willing to confront him openly, and Maggie sensed that hesitation as the beginning of his collapse. The girl whispered her mother's name with a trembling hope that rippled through the room, and the operative's expression flickered with something almost human, perhaps regret, perhaps fear, before he stepped back toward the open doorway, recognizing that his pursuit had reached a point where continuation would expose him to forces he could no longer manipulate. Maggie held his gaze with quiet, unwavering strength, silently reminding him that the truth would continue unraveling long after he disappeared into whatever shadows he came from. With a final, frustrated breath, the operative retreated into the dim light outside, disappearing with the eerie silence of someone accustomed to leaving no trace, and the tension in the diner slowly dissolved as though the room itself exhaled for the first time in hours. The father collapsed to his knees beside his daughter, pulling her tightly into his arms, whispering apologies shaped by years of misplaced blame and promises born from newfound resolve, and Maggie felt tears gather at the edges of her own vision as she watched the fragile reunion unfold. The intruder remained slumped against the wall, stripped of arrogance and power, murmuring that he would help them uncover whatever truth remained buried, because he finally understood the cost of the lies he had helped protect. Maggie offered him a slow, measured nod, accepting the first step of redemption with the same grace she extended to every wounded soul who passed through her diner's doors. The girl looked up at Maggie, eyes softening with a mixture of gratitude and lingering fear, and she wrapped her small arms around the elderly woman's waist in a gesture so pure it softened even the harshest corners of the morning. Maggie rested her hand atop the girl's head, whispering that kindness, especially the quiet kind, carried more power than any threat dressed in money or lineage, and the father echoed her sentiment with a trembling voice heavy with newfound understanding. As the morning light finally broke through the diner windows, catching the carved phoenix on the wooden box with a soft golden shimmer, Maggie felt the world settle back into place with gentle certainty, knowing that the truth, once freed, rarely allowed itself to be hidden again. And in that humble diner, beneath the glow of warm light and lingering fear, she understood that sometimes justice arrived not through grand battles or powerful allies, but through the quiet defiance of ordinary people refusing to let innocence be swallowed by the shadows.